G'day guys, Clayton from Workbench Hobbies here. Now I thought it would be a bit of fun to go through some of the questions I've been getting through YouTube and Facebook and share them with the group on these off weeks where I don't have any modelling content to present. However, I'm sure if people are asking me questions on these forums, there will be a lot of you who have similar questions, so I thought this may be a helpful little video to maybe highlight or reinforce some of the stuff you didn't know or already knew. So with that in mind, let's go. So Michael T writes in, and wasn't really a question, it was more letting me know that the Mr. Surfacer primers do come in a jar, not just in the bottle. Now, you may have noticed in some of the videos I talk about how I decant the Mr. Surfacer primer from the can, and I do this because I find the mix that comes out of the can is always perfect. I don't have to touch it. I can decant it from the spraying can into a little glass jar, then use it through my airbrush, and I know it's perfect every time. It'll never dry out in the can, and that's why I choose to do it like that rather than having the jars and mixing it up with a thinner. Now to decant, just to quickly breeze over what I'm doing there, is all you'll need is a glass jar and a bendable drinking straw. And what I do is pop one end of the straw in the glass jar and the other end of the straw is up against the nozzle of the spray can. And then by depressing the button, I'm able to transfer some of the fluid from the can into the jar. But a word of warning, you need to let that paint outgas. You will find that as soon as you do it, the mix will start to bubble. That's the propellant that was in the can outgassing out of that paint. If you were to put that paint straight into your airbrush and try to spray it, it would probably work, but it might bubble and pop and spray and make a heck of a mess. So always best to let it outgas for at least a day before you're using it. But hopefully that sort of sheds some light into why I'm using the primer out of the rattle can rather than mixing it out of the jar. So Kane writes in and he asks, what are the must-have weathering paints that the beginner should purchase to start out? Thanks for the question, Kane, and it's actually a really complex question, believe it or not. It sounds like a really simple one, but the answer is it depends.
Depends on what?
So I won't actually answer the question just yet, but it depends on what paint you're using. However, I'd like to answer the question with a technique is probably the best thing to learn for the beginner. Now, pin washing, if I was starting out or if I was teaching someone who was starting out how to weather, applying a pin wash to your model is the most easy and basic of the weathering steps. However, it can add the most impact and dynamic to your model. I believe it is the most powerful tool in the modeler's toolkit to set the foundation for any successful weathering job you're doing on your models. But to double back a little bit, just to quickly gloss over the different paint types. There's acrylics, enamels, and lacquers. Again, I'm generally speaking, but they are the three types of paint that most people would use in this hobby. Acrylics tend to be a little, I don't want to speak badly of acrylics, but a little weaker or not as strong as some of the other paints. However, they are less toxic as they are water-based. You can brush paint them, you can blow them through your airbrush. A lot of people will use acrylics. And the brands that are most common in the hobby would be AK Interactive, Ammo by MIG, Vallejo, and the Citadel Workshop stuff. Now, the next type of paint would be an enamel paint. Now, this is a bit of an old school sort of a paint that most people would have painted their models in back in the day, probably more because it was accessible rather than it was good. Not so common these days, as most people would either use acrylics or lacquers. However, enamels make great weathering products, but we'll come back to that later. Downside with enamels is the smell. it's that traditional turpentine smell because they are thinned using a white spirit. And the last type of paint in the hobby is a lacquer paint. Now again, there's all types of lacquers. There's acrylic lacquers, there's true lacquers, but let's just call them lacquers for the sake of the short video. Now lacquers are things like Tamiya and AK Real Color, and then you've got your true lacquers like your SMS and your oh god, I've forgotten what it is. MRP. MRP. They are your true lacquers. Now the lacquers are very hard wearing, they spray beautifully, they've got great coverage. Downside is they're a lacquer based paint, so the smell is very strong and they're quite toxic. So if you're going to use them, generally speaking, you'd want to use some sort of respirator or some sort of protection, or at least have a spray booth, or at least open the window in the room and make sure you've got decent ventilation. However, I find, and that is my paint of choice, is the lacquer paints, just because of the durability and the ease of use. So, as I mentioned, most modelers would either paint with an acrylic or a lacquer, and what that means is when it comes to weathering and washes, your enamel-based or oil-based washes are going to usually give you the best results. And again, there's no absolutes. There's lots of ways you can achieve this, but what I would recommend is getting yourself a pre-thinned wash from either AK or Ammo. They're pre-thinned enamel wash that are thinned with the white spirit or an enamel thinner, which is more or less the same thing, that you can mix up and touch around details on your model, around raised rivets, recesses and whatnot. And that mix, that thinned mix, will run around the recesses and it'll immediately give the details a pop and give your model that little bit of extra lift. It'll take it from looking like a toy to starting to look like a nice scale representation of what you're trying to model. So, in a roundabout way, that's what I'd suggest. If you're painting with a lacquer or an acrylic, look to buy a pre-thinned enamel wash and learn how to pin wash. It's so powerful. So Big and Tall 666 has said to me, Panzer Grey is almost black. You missed the point.
You kind of missed the point there, buddy.
Now, this was in response to my Panzer 38T video I did, and whilst Big and Tall 666 is clearly not a fan of my work, that's okay, but it actually gives me an opportunity to raise an interesting point about the scale effect and painting in scale. So what I find is, again, generally speaking, the smaller the scale or the smaller the model, the lighter I would go from the mid-tone of that colour. So I wouldn't paint a 30-second scale vehicle the same colour as I'd paint the same vehicle if it was 70-second scale. I would go lighter in 70-second scale. You have to remember, when you're looking at a one-to-one subject like a tank in the field, you're looking at a one-to-one subject under one-to-one lighting, and the way that the light works on that is going to differ to something that you are looking at that is, say, 35th scale, looking through one-to-one light. As the modeler, we're trying to trick the person who's looking at the model into thinking that what they're looking at is significantly bigger than the small thing in front of them. So how we do that, or at least how I do it, or try to do it, is by tweaking the midtones, tweaking the highlights, making the highlights brighter, and then by creating artificial shadows, and things like washes will also bring out the detail and whatnot. So yeah, I understand that Panzer Grey is almost black, but I can guarantee you if I was to paint a 35th scale model a couple of shades off black, it's going to look crazy. It's going to look like it's got no detail and a big black blob on the table. So hopefully that's addressed why I choose to lighten the midtones and the paintwork to try and compensate for that scale effect. Lucas P has said, Vallejo has got a special colour for rubber. It is 70.306 dark rubber. It's worth a try. It dries in a nice satin finish like rubber. Now this was in response to, I think it was my suggestion to use a Vallejo black grey for the rubber parts of road wheels and things. Again, every paint manufacturer has got their own mix of rubber, and I'm sure they're all excellent. I guess the thing with rubber is to understand that rubber is actually never a true black. It's always, or again, generally speaking, a shade of grey. So bearing that in mind, the one I like to use is Vallejo black grey, or if I'm going to spray it with a lacquer paint, I would be using like a Tamiya rubber black or an AK Real Colour rubber black. Adam Mann has written in, your rhino inserts and other interruptions influenced me to turn this off 3 minutes in.
Serenity now!
And thanks, Adam. I appreciate you took the time to connect, and I understand that my sense of humour isn't going to appeal to everybody, and that's okay. I just need to find a way to keep myself amused with these videos, and I'll take it on the chin. I was probably going a little hard early on, and it's something I'm scaling back a little bit in. So all I could say is please give me another opportunity, but the gags are probably going to stay because it's just my way of keeping it a bit light for me during the editing process. Brendan Mason has written in, and he's responded to me. He's seen me using the little bottle tops to mix paint in. And he said, I love that idea of using bottle caps for mini easels, which is not something I remembered from when I last painted minis, literally last century. And he's asked, do you bother washing them to reuse, or do you just chuck them afterwards? Oh, okay, I've misinterpreted this question. I don't wash them. I don't wash them before I use them, and I don't wash them after I use them. I unfortunately generate a significant number of bottle tops over a weekend, and there seems to be a steady stream of the things. So no, one use, throw them away. Will Thorson, or maybe Torson, excuse me for the pronunciation, Will, has suggested that I try mixing flesh as my lightning colour with the German grey, as it keeps the depth in the colour and is a different way of lightening the paint rather than using white, which can tend to desaturate it. And I really like that idea, so I've trialled that on the Panzer II build I'm currently working on. I've used an AK sand colour mixed with the XF63 German grey, the Tamiya paints, the two paints, the Real Colour and the Tamiya paints mix beautifully as they are acrylic lacquers. And yeah, I really like the idea. It's kept the depth and the warmth in the colour, and certainly an interesting way to lighten the paint. So I'd suggest that you guys, when you're lightening your paint at home, try different things. Try the different tones, different things. Like I love doing with the 4BO, the Russian green colour. I love lightening that with yellow green, for instance. So different colours to lighten the mixes will give you different tones and different hues, and just experiment with that on your models and you might be surprised. And finally, Daniel Barnes has written in asking what the little sticks around the hull mounted tracks on the front of the Panzer 38 were, or at least were made from. And what he's referring to is seagrass, and it's a little ball of marine stuff that washes up on beaches around the world. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen here in Australia, or at least that I know of. So I've got my little balls of seagrass through AK Interactive, and how I use them is take the ball out of the packet and then using a pair of scissors, just clip away small fine clippings of the product, and then place it around your model, and you set it in place using either a thinned PVA glue or a sand and ballast freeze or a clear varnish or something like that. And those little clippings and debris are just supposed to represent, grass that's been kicked up, or debris, or just any sort of foliage that's kicked up. It's great to mix it in with a mud paste and use it with pigments and things like that. It's just another way to add a little bit of organic material to your model and a little bit of tone and texture to what you're trying to present. It just helps sell the model as being bigger than it is. So that's it for my first round of Ask Me questions. I hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've found some value in the video. If you liked it, please hit the like and consider subscribing. It's helping me a lot. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below or reach out to me on Facebook. Once we get enough questions to do another video, I'll do another video. If we're not getting any questions, then it's pretty simple. I'll do another video. So yeah, reach out to me on Facebook, through YouTube, ask me questions, share it around, and remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your friends and connect with your community. It's so important. See you soon.
G'day, guys. I'm the brains behind the...
It's recording.
Oh.